Well, I appreciate you being here tonight. You got me again. Welcome to the third on the third with a little bit of a different third. Most of you know that on the third Sunday, I usually do the third chapter of a particular book. Take my word for it, there is no third chapter that has anything to do with Christmas. So I looked at the third chapter of Exodus, and at a time when most of us, or at least us and many people, have a flammable tree in their living room wrapped in electric lights, probably not a good time to talk about a burning bush. So I thought we'd save Exodus 3 for January and look at a different third. If you look at that nativity up there, there's 3 people in it. A lot of stories about the guy in the middle, appropriately so, he's the reason for the season. A lot of stories about the woman on the left, what she went through. The guy on the right, almost nothing. He has what is arguably the most important job in the entire New Testament. The earthly father and protector of the incarnate Son of God. And none of the gospel writers ever recorded a single word he said. We can read every verse that has anything to do with Joseph tonight. We're going to read most of them. But a lot of people have called him the forgotten man. Nobody talks about him, what he went through. And you know, when I did the study on Emmanuel, that's based on Gabriel's talking in a dream to Joseph. So that's kind of where this comes from. But you got to see the big picture. When you've got somebody like this where only their actions and none of their words are recorded, none of their background is given, none of their future is given, what you have to do is look at the times in which they lived. You have to look at the big picture, you know, the times make the man. This isn't all going to have to do with Joseph. I kind of want you to get an idea of what the world was like at the first Christmas. We have a completely different viewpoint of what it was probably really like. And frankly, this may offend some of you tonight. Just to prove that I didn't come up with all of this, one of the books is Customs and Controversies, the intertestamental Jewish background of the New Testament. Culver's The Life of Christ, Barclay's The Life of Christ, Edersham's The Life of Times of Jesus the Messiah, a bunch on my Kindle, The Jesus I Never Knew, Max Lucado's book, 10 Men of the Bible, his Joseph section. You gotta look a lot to find anything at all about Joseph. I'm trying to get my Kindle to start here because in a minute I'm going to have to hit a quote. They were going to, come on, I know there's not a wireless here. Now then, if I just knew how to get to the bookmarks, we'd be great. There it is. Perfect. So the first thing we want to do is look at the world into which Jesus was born. Why did Jesus pick being a first century Jew? He could have been born into time, anytime. Why is he not a little Jewish boy in 21st century America? I mean, stop and think. If he was ministering in this day and age with telecommunications and the internet, most of the world could have watched the Sermon on the Mount live. I can just see the tweet now. 5,000 of us listening to sermon. Now they're serving lunch. Just fish and bread. Where'd they get that? Baskets all over the place. I mean, I would love to see an Instagram photo of Jesus standing in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. And you can see Lazarus walking out of his tomb, everybody holding their iPhones up. But he didn't choose to come now. He chose to come in the first century. He chose to come at a point where God had shaped history for his ministry to be what it should be. Now, if you want to get the big picture, around the time of his birth, this is a quotation, the Roman poet Virgil wrote a phrase, "The new order of the ages in the 1st century BC. He said, and I quote, "A new human race is descending from the heights of heaven, a change which will come about due to the birth of a child, with whom the iron age of humanity will end and the golden age will begin." Problem is, he was talking about a baby named Octavius Gaius, who was born the grandnephew and eventual adopted son of his uncle Julius, who was a general, and in 49 took his troops across the Rubicon and overthrew the republic that was Rome and adopted the name Caesar. And he adopted Octavius, about whom Virgil wrote, and Octavius became Octavian, who, when he had defeated Brutus, Cassius, and General Pompey, after their assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC, in 29 he took the name Augustus. And a few years later, took the name Augustus Caesar as the undisputed ruler of the world. And it wasn't long after that, look at the quotes, they declared him God. To quote Bill Murray in Groundhog Day, not the God, a God. But he was a God. That's who they were talking about. You have to understand Rome and what Rome did in the Middle East to understand where Joseph is coming from. At this time, most of the known world enjoys what's called the Pax Romana, peace. Did you know that the word gospel is borrowed? The word gospel was coined to describe the rule of Caesar Augustus. The good news that Rome was stable and the world was peaceful under the rule of Caesar in Rome. That's where the word gospel was first used. The New Testament writers borrowed it and used it to describe salvation. So that's what's happening in the world. Now, in in Israel, we've got the Pax Romana in most of the world, except for that one little gadfly, Palestine. And the Romans hated them because they simply would not bend to the Roman yoke. Between 67 BC and 37 BC, 150,000 men were killed in Judea and Galilee in uprisings against Rome. Pompey goes into Rome about 30 years during this time, actually conquers Jerusalem with the assistance of a local strong man named Herod, who becomes the Roman puppet. What most people don't realize is that when Pompey conquered Jerusalem, he walked into the temple. The priests during the fight did not stop their daily sacrifice. They continued working, and most of them were killed on the premises of the temple. Pompey walked through them, walked through the holy place, and went and stood to see what was in the Holy of Holies. It was such a big deal, and it was empty. And we still don't know where the Ark of the Covenant went. Because when Pompey conquered Jerusalem, it was gone. So, that's you have to understand this because there's another quote here. It took 30 years for Roman armies to quash all signs of rebellion. They installed a local strongman, Herod, as their puppet king of the Jews. As Herod watched the Romans killing women and children in their houses, markets, and even in the temple. He turned to a Roman general and said, "Would the Romans deprive the city of all its inhabitants and possessions and leave me a king of the wilderness?" Almost. By the time Herod ascended to the throne, Jerusalem and most of Judea lay in ruins. Herod the Great still reigned when Jesus was born. Palestine stayed relatively quiet under his iron thumb. An earthquake killed 30,000 people in 31 BC. The reason I bring this up, the rabbis at that time referred to all of these things happening as the birth pangs of the Messiah and pled for a deliverer who would deliver them from Herod. When you begin to read this, you begin to understand that the Messiah the Jews were looking for is not the Messiah that was initially prophesied, and it's not the Messiah that we've come to know. Matter of fact, there's a lot of Roman and history in Palestine that we've never even heard. How many of you have ever heard of the city of Sepphoris? Not Sephora, that's the makeup place. Sepphoris. Second largest city in Israel. Just a few miles from Nazareth. Joseph probably spent his time rebuilding Sepphoris. It was one of the most important Roman cities in Palestine, and Jesus never set foot there. It is not mentioned at all in the New Testament. There's another city, Tiberias. Tiberias was on the banks of the Sea of Galilee, which was sometimes called the Sea of Tiberias. Herod built it. It was either his winter or his summer palace. Can't remember which one, but it was one of those. Jews wouldn't go to Tiberias because Herod built it on top of a Jewish cemetery. Had the best view of the lake. Jesus never went to Tiberias. He never went to Sepphoris. As a matter of fact, the interesting thing about Sepphoris is, to give you an idea of what it was like in Palestine when Joseph was an adult. In 4 BC, a Jewish rebel snuck into Sepphoris. He broke into the armory and stole enough arms to begin a new rebellion. And his allies threw the Romans out of Sepphoris for a little while and managed to take the city. The Romans did not care for that. They retook the city in fairly short order, burned it to the ground, tore down every stone in the city, and crucified 2,000 people in one day. That's how they shut the rebellion down. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons most commentators think Joseph went to Nazareth, since he was a carpenter, is that Sepphoris was being rebuilt. And most of the stonemasons and carpenters in Galilee got jobs rebuilding the Roman city of Sepphoris. That's where power is, on the end of a sword. Now then, let's look a little bit at the Bible. Let's go to Matthew, and we're going to start piece by piece pulling apart what we can. Got it in Luke. I got to back up here. Matthew, the first chapter, the 18th verse. Now, prior to this, and very importantly, Matthew has gone through the genealogies of Jesus. Now, I realize there are two genealogies. They don't necessarily match, but they do if you look at it from a Jewish standpoint, and that's further than I need to go into tonight. Now, the birth of Jesus Christ was as follows. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph. So, the first thing we need to talk about is the Jewish custom of betrothal. It's not what you think it is. Or maybe it is, I don't know. But it's far more complex than you think it is. The Jewish marital customs of that day, most of this comes out of this, and an online thing called the Jewish Learning Library. Here's how betrothal would go. Usually when a person had reached a marriageable age, actually in Jewish society they were kind of allowed to pick one another, but if they hadn't found an acceptable marriage partner, their families would. The man would come to the bride's father's house. In the presence of two witnesses, they would write up a betrothal contract. The contract would specify what had to be paid to the bride's mother or father as a bride price. It would specify the damages that had to be paid to the father or the bride in the case of divorce or death of either partner. After that contract had been witnessed, signed, and accepted by both families, as far as Jewish law is concerned, at the time they were married. And the part that we don't realize and is completely different than most people look at Mary's pregnancy and talk about the whispering of illegitimacy. Max Lucado talks about the fact that Joseph could have gone to Bethlehem by himself. He didn't need to drag his pregnant wife with him, but he took her to avoid having her deliver in specious circumstances in the home village. That's not really true. If you look at Jewish law of that time as far back as the Mishnah. Now remember, Jewish law, the written law, the Torah, first 5 books, oral law, the Mishnah. And about the 3rd century, the Mishnah was written down and codified. They initially didn't write down the Mishnah. It was oral law. It was passed from rabbi to rabbi. But after Jerusalem burned, a lot of them decided, well, we may not live, so maybe we should write some of this stuff down. For instance, the Torah says, you shall remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. The Mishnah defines 38 categories of work that may or may not be done on the Sabbath day, and each of those 38 categories has 39 subcategories of work that might or might not be allowed to be done on a Sabbath day. But according to the Mishnah, as far back as that, there was no prohibition for a betrothed couple to come together in marital intimacy. They were married. In fact, the way they divorced was to give a divorcement contract, which is called a get. And in that divorcement contract, all the man had to write at that time was, I don't like you anymore. I want a divorce. If a woman had a baby within 9 months of being divorced, and she had a get, a divorcement contract, that baby was the legitimate son of the person she divorced. If she didn't have that contract, the baby was illegitimate. The Jews considered marriage to be a process. The betrothal, a certain amount of time for both to decide they were old enough to leave home. The next part was there was a great procession where the bride went from her father's house to her husband's house, and then a great ceremony and a feast that sometimes took weeks. Sometimes the whole process took years. But as far as they were concerned, they were married. Now, let's finish reading again 18 and 19. Before they came together, she was found to be with child by the Holy Spirit. And Joseph, her husband, being a righteous man and not wanting to disgrace her, planned to divorce her secretly. Now, what sort of disgrace would it have been had this been public? Look at Deuteronomy 22, 20 through 24. But if this charge is true, that the girl is not found a virgin, they shall bring out the girl to the doorway of her father's house, and the men of her city shall stone her to death, because she has committed an act of folly in Israel by playing the harlot in her father's house. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you. Mary would have been stoned had Joseph chosen to make this public. But in order to send her away secretly, he had to bring in 2 witnesses to the house and write a get, a divorcement contract, and give it to her in the presence of those 2 witnesses. That contract would have legitimized Jesus. As far as the village was concerned, Jesus was Joseph's son. As far as the Mishnah and the law, if a betrothed woman showed up pregnant by her betrothed husband, that's okay. And you have to remember the timeline. So let's kind of shift a little bit. Because of time, I'm not going to go back to all the verses, but remember that when Gabriel came to Mary and told her she was going to conceive, he told her that Elizabeth, her kinswoman, was pregnant. And she left to go be with her kinswoman from Nazareth. Now, it actually doesn't record where Elizabeth and her husband lived, but most people think it was a village that's about 5 miles west of Jerusalem. Now, Bethlehem is about 2 miles south of Jerusalem, southwest. It's about 90 miles from Bethlehem. I've seen 70 to 90 from Nazareth to Bethlehem, depending on how you go. And then we can go into the geography. You know, you've got Judea here, you've got Samaria with the plain of Jezreel coming across, and then up here is Galilee with Nazareth sitting on the side of a hill overlooking the plain of Jezreel. It's an absolutely gorgeous spot. And in this day, it was one of the most fertile spots in the Middle East. Now, if you've ever been to the Middle East and you read things about it being fertile, you wonder what the sheep eat besides rocks, because that's all you see in the pictures. Which do you think gets more rain? Jerusalem, London, or Berlin? Their annual rainfall is almost the same. It's just Jerusalem gets all of their rainfall between November and April. And the rest of the time, it doesn't rain at all. At the time of Jesus' birth, this was a verdant, green, beautiful place. You say, where are all the trees? When the Ottoman Turks took over Palestine, they put a tax on trees. So if you had trees on your property, you had to pay a tax for every tree. So everybody cut down all the trees so they wouldn't have to pay the tax. That's where the trees went. That's why there are almost no trees in the Middle East. They cut them all down during the Ottoman Empire because they had a tax. So Mary is told that Elizabeth, and Gabriel says, is in her 6th month. Now, to just refresh your memory about, and I tell one of these stories, and I know I've got about 1 million rabbit trails running everywhere. Elizabeth and her husband, he's a priest. Now, the Levitic priesthood was divided into 24 sections. Each section was centered around a particular city. They served 2 weeks a year. They began their service when they were 25 and never retired. There is no retirement age listed in Jewish law. Rabbi Hillel of that time says that the aged refers to somebody who's 60 or over. But remember, they had no children. The angel appears to her husband while he's chosen to put the incense in the golden altar. The way that would have been, 3 priests would have gone into the temple. One was there to wipe away the ashes from the previous day. Another was carrying a fire pan from the brazen altar outside where the coals were, and he would come in and put the coals on the golden altar and then back out. And then Elizabeth's husband, Simon, if I remember right, can't believe I blocked it on that, but anyway, would then put the incense so that the holy incense would go up and go over the curtain into the Holy of Holies. And when that happened, Gabriel appears to him and tells him his wife is going to have a child. And Gabriel responds with, yeah, how do I know that's true? Because we're both really old. And Gabriel strikes him mute for his disbelief and says, you will not say another word until your baby's born and you name him John. So he comes out of the temple and he can't talk. He can't tell anybody what's happened. And he's seen an angel. He and Elizabeth go back home. She's pregnant. Now it's 6 months later. Gabriel comes to Mary, says, your kinswoman's pregnant. Takes Mary probably 2 weeks, maybe 3. You don't walk 65 miles for the weekend. So Mary goes to see her. She probably stays there through the entire last trimester of Elizabeth's pregnancy. It isn't reported that Mary's there at the delivery. And when they do the scene where he's named John, Mary is not recorded as being there. But most people think Mary probably stayed there about 3 months. So she comes back to Nazareth 3 to 3.5 months pregnant. It's the kind of time you could hide it from everybody else because you've seen the robes they wear, but you can't really hide it from your family. Do you think she told Joseph that an angel came and told her that she was pregnant by God? What I see in Joseph is someone who's crazy in love with this woman, and she goes to see her cousin for 3 months, and she comes back pregnant. And he is shattered. But he still cares so much for her. You know, some of us would be so angry, they would take the route of dragging her up to the gate and denouncing her in front of the elders and watching them stone her. But he just can't imagine losing her that way. Now, in the verse where it says, being a righteous man, that phrase is important. Joseph, according to Max Lucado, that phrase means that Joseph is what is called a tzaddik, which is sort of an amateur rabbi. He said if it was in modern times, we would use the term deacon or elder. That's somebody who has a regular job, but they spend their time studying the law, they know the law, they obey the law, and they're held in high regard by their fellow citizens. If Joseph writes her a certificate of divorce, it saves her life. But what does it make Joseph look like? It says she's having my baby and I'm dumping her. Joseph was willing to destroy his own reputation to make himself look like a villain, a cad, a Lothario, a terrible human being who has betrayed the law in front of everybody else in Nazareth in order to legitimize Jesus and save Mary. That's what he was going to do. There's no, question of whether or not Jesus is going to be made fun of. I've read all those things. That's not what Joseph was doing. Joseph was trying to save Mary's life, and he was willing to, he just couldn't bring himself to want to go ahead and marry her but he couldn't bring himself to get her stoned either. So his only choice is to ruin his own reputation, to follow the law and legitimize Jesus' birth. I think maybe she had told him about Gabriel. And he's thinking, well, maybe that is the case. If that is God's child, then I need to protect that little fellow. But I'm not sure. So what does he do? But when he had considered this, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream. Now, again, that's a fascinating thing, the idea of dreams. Dreams were, at this particular time in Jewish custom, a sign of God's favor. In fact, there was a saying in Jewish folklore, if a man sleeps 7 nights and recalls no dreams, you may call him wicked, because God has not given him good dreams. Therefore, he's in sin, he's wicked. So the whole business, because, have you ever had a dream and jumped up the next morning to immediately do what you did in the dream? I haven't, can't fly anyway, but I haven't. And I've not gone up and jumped off anything just to see if I could, even if I did in the dream and flew away, okay? I didn't do that. But an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child who has been conceived of her is of the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. And skipping down to 24, and Joseph awoke from his sleep and did as the angel of the Lord commanded, and took Mary as his wife, but kept her a virgin until she gave birth to a son and called his name Jesus. Joseph's response to the command of God was immediate and unquestioned obedience. So what else does he end up? I could jump over to Luke, but frankly, I've got a whole lot more other stuff, so I'm going to try to finish in a reasonable amount of time. Summarize the story. Remember, he and Mary, actually, there is something we need to talk about in Luke, so I'm going to jump there anyway. Glad I brought this. Zacharias, that was Elizabeth's husband. So, in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken of all the inhabited earth. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Okay, let's talk about that problem right there. Quirinius became governor of Syria in 6 AD, when Jesus was about 10. Herod died in 4 BC. 10 years before. But look at the word in the second verse. This was the first census taken. That word first in Greek is prote. That can mean first, but it can also mean before. Because there was another census taken. Quirinius was military general in Syria for a long period of time before he became the governor. And there had been a previous census taken before. The census that was taken after Quirinius was governor was actually one of the things that started the Zealot rebellion. And Josephus talks about it. Quirinius actually came to Jerusalem because the Jews rebelled against having a census taken. So a better translation is, this was the census taken before Quirinius was governor of Syria. Because he doesn't want it mixed up with the one that was taken while he was governor of Syria, because that's 10 years later, and that causes a rebellion. Now, each person goes, the story, goes to their house of their, ancestral home. Why am I bringing this one up? So, baby is delivered, shepherds come, bunch of other stuff about the whole end thing, but we won't go through that. Look at verse 21. And when 8 days had passed before his circumcision, his name was called Jesus, the name given by the angel before he was conceived in the womb. And now then, between verse 21 and verse 22, there are 4 weeks. There's no indication of that. But the circumcision was on day 8, and her purification is not completed for at least a month. So I actually always thought those were the same visit. Those are actually 3 weeks apart. And that's important because when you jump down to 38, at the very moment she came up and began giving thanks to God, this is during Jesus' visit to the temple as a baby for Mary's sacrificial cleansing. And look at verse 39. When they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, their own city of Nazareth. Between 38 and 39, there's at least 2 years, probably closer to 6. Because remember what happens in Bethlehem? The visit of the Magi. And Herod orders all the babies who are 2 years old or under killed. Now, that's a terrible thing, but it was really in character with Herod. And it was actually a fairly minor thing for Herod to have done compared to the other things. They once crucified 400 Pharisees in one day, simply because they disagreed and protested Roman rule. So Jesus' sojourn in Egypt. So here's my point about that. Why did Joseph not immediately return to Nazareth? Why did he stay in Bethlehem for 2 years before the Magi got there? Probably a year and a half before he went to Egypt. Joseph didn't go to Bethlehem just for the census. Joseph moved his family to Bethlehem. Why? Because the Messiah comes from Bethlehem. He knows the law. The angel told us our son is the Messiah. The Messiah comes from Bethlehem. We're moving to Bethlehem. He moves the family there. But it is also prophesied that he shall be called a Nazarene. So God uses the visit of the Magi and the visit of another angel. Get up, move out of Bethlehem, and go to Egypt. How does Joseph respond? He gets up, packs him up, and walks to Egypt. Immediate, unquestioned obedience. He thinks he's doing what he's supposed to do, and he's told to do something else. And he responds with immediate, unquestioned obedience. When he's in when he's in Egypt, again, he's visited after Herod dies, after God strikes him dead. Now, what happens is that Herod leaves Judea and Idumea to his son Archelaus, and he leaves Galilee and I think Samaria and the Decapolis to his son Antipas. And he says, okay, you can go back to Judea. But he doesn't want to go back to Bethlehem because he's afraid they're still looking for the baby. So he goes to Nazareth, their old city, which is now being ruled by the Herod that Jesus will refer to as that old fox. It is being ruled by the Herod that will eventually execute John the Baptist. It is the Herod before whom Paul will be tried with Agrippa. See how it all ties together? And the reason I wanted to mention the thing about the other census that when Quirinius was governor, because Archelaus, who was Herod's son, who becomes king, the Jews hated him. And they were constantly complaining to the Romans about him. And when Quirinius came to Jerusalem and it triggers a revolution, The Romans depose Archelaus, throw him out as a king, and install a governor, a guy named Pontius Pilate. What you see in the story, when you study the customs, when you study the time, when you study the history, is God preparing the world for his Messiah. Roman roads, Roman mail, Roman peace. The governors. I could go into the religious parties, all the history, everything, all poised. The whole world thinks someone is going to come. They just think it's Augustus in Rome and not a baby in a manger. Let us all, when God's will is revealed to us, react like that guy did, with immediate and unquestioning obedience.
I want to thank you for tuning into our program. It's been a delight to have you. I trust that you understand a little bit more about what Jesus Christ did for you when he died on the cross. Salvation is not something that you receive because you're born into a family or because you go to church or because you're good. Salvation is a free gift, but that gift has to be received. If you have not received it, we'd like to have you take some time to talk to God and ask him that he might be your Savior. You understand that you are a sinner, that Jesus Christ died for you, that you can know that you have eternal life by putting your trust in Christ today.